Teleshikues tal UK TV mirë mrama, mirë se vini tek emisioni Zeri Diaspores, marë parasysh gjendjen dhe hecurinë e luftës në Ukrainë si okupator Rusia dhe zhvillimet në Evropë dhe në perëndim përgjithësi përkrahje me Shtetet Bashkuara të Amerikës, çfarë efekti kanë të gjitha këto kalkulime apo vështirësi që është krijuar tani një modalitet I ri luftës në Ballkan përgjithësi, sidomos në Kosovë, Bosnjën dhe Serbinë që kanë qenë në një periudhë të luftës para pak vitesh, përfshirë dhe Kroacinë, për ju sot kam zotri Adnan Ćerimagić, cili është me origjinë nga Bosnja dhe është analist I rajonit të Ballkanit dhe studiues I mirë I pozitës dhe ligjeve dhe rregullave evropiane, kështu që do të na ndihmoj pak më shumë të sqarohemi se ku gjendemi dhe çfarë forme ndoshta duhet të gjendet Ballkani këto periudha, të marr parasysh se zotri Ćerimagić ka qenë qysh në fillimet e pas luftës deri me tani involvuar direkt në gjithë ngjarjet që kanë ndodhur në rajon. Mr. Adnan Ćerimagić, thanks for being with us today and thanks for spending the time and helping us to understand a bit more about how the Balkans are and what the war in Russia, the way it had affected Europe.
Thank you very much for having me. Happy to talk to you.
Thank you again. First of all, going to Russian war. Russia is considered as an aggression against Ukraine and against sovereign country with no kind of specific reason for it. How do you take this on and what do you think about it?
I think we are living through a dramatic times in Europe and in the world, because what we are seeing here is a country, a sovereign country with a nuclear weapon, taking its tanks and taking its guns and invading another sovereign country with an aim that we don't fully understand, but what we do understand from what the Russians are saying, the aim is to change the democratically elected government in Ukraine. And I think that dramatically changes the worldview, changes the relations in Europe, and makes the entire continent and the world understand that the times when times of peace and times of security that some Europeans have taken maybe even for granted are over. And that in order to make sure that this war, which is terrible and has terrible consequences for Ukrainians, does not spread to other countries in Europe, EU, NATO, and Western countries, together with the US, Canada, and some other countries, will need to do a lot of heavy lifting to make sure that this, first of all, that this war doesn't spread, and second of all, that this war ends.
Do you think the Western world was swift enough to react to it? And what could they do better, considering that it's, I think, the 40th or 50th day now since the war started?
On one hand, it is clear that the Russians expected a swift invasion on Ukraine. They've expected to get to Kiev, to change the government within days or within a couple of weeks, and that hasn't not happened. And I think that part of the reason for that is definitely the courageousness of Ukrainian people and its leadership, but also the way that the initial reaction from the EU and from the Western allies was. And I think that in the first couple of weeks, EU together with the US and the UK has showed enormous unity and has shown that it's capable to react, and that it's more importantly willing to react to what Russians were doing. However, in the past month or so, what we can see is a diversification. We have allies of Ukraine, such as UK or the US, that are contributing more than some of the European some of their European partners. And I have to tell you here in Berlin, where I sit, there's a lot of criticism, not just from outside towards Germany and Berlin, and how little it is being delivering when it comes to the weapons delivery, for example, when it comes to reluctance to introduce energy embargo on Russia, but at the same time to offer Ukraine a European perspective that it needs. And I think it's not just from the outside that the criticism comes, it's also from the inside. We see not just from the opposition party, but also from within the ruling coalition, a lot of different opinions and movements. So yes, definitely a united response, initial response by the Western world, let's say it like that, was a surprise. But at the moment we see a bit of a difference, and we would need to see a more robust response, in particular from here in Berlin, which at the moment is missing and is being heavily criticized from outside and from the inside.
To what you recall, is it because they are scared of Russia, or because then they have a problem with the energy and supplies that they kind of got used in cheap way from Russia, or there is any other reason that we're seeing this kind of division within Europe?
I think that the bottom line is generations of politicians and public in Germany have grown up and have done their careers, political careers, with an assumption that Germany needs to serve as sort of a bridge to Russia, and that through economic and cultural relations with Russia, it needs to make sure that Russia is being a cooperative and not being aggressive towards Europe and towards its neighbors. And now, after decades of that policy, 2 decades, I would say, of policy with President Putin going down the drain, so to say, a big part of the political elite is not capable to digest this change and is not capable to react to this change. Yes, of course, economic interests play an important role. Tradition of not delivering weapons to areas such as Ukraine, in the sense of the closeness and the relations that Germany has to Russia, it plays a role. But I think at the bottom line, the problem or the issue is that the big chunk of political elite is incapable to digest the changes that we have seen. What gives me a bit of optimism and hope is the fact that there's a lot of politicians in the ruling coalition, in the opposition, but also in public, that are supportive and that are pushing for a more robust response from Berlin.
How does the election in France kind of affecting all the kind of teamwork that has been created so far? Do you think that if Marine Le Pen wins, we're going to have a tough time within Europe to actually continue with a kind of well-organized Europe acting as they promised?
I think that the political elite here in Berlin, but also observers, are simply hoping that President Macron will get re-elected, because any other option is so dramatic, it's so fundamentally going to change not just the current policies in the EU, but also potential future policies, such as related to reforms, that I think very few are seriously considering and thinking what actually would happen. Of course, a lot of attention here in Berlin has been given to the fact that young people in surveys are more supportive for Le Pen as a president, and that gives reason to be afraid for the future of France and for the future of Europe, for the mere fact, even if President Macron wins now, these young generations, if they're not worked with, if they don't find another political alternative for themselves, Europe will inevitably have problems. One does consider that Le Pen in these presidential campaign has changed slightly its positions when it comes to the EU, when it comes to what she as a president of France might do, but nobody believes her, let's say, basic instincts not reappearing in the case if she's elected. So I would say the fear of President Le Pen and what it could be, what could mean for the current policies towards Russia, current policies on various issues, transatlantic relations, and on many other aspects, but also on the future of reforms of the EU, what happens with the enlargement, what happens with the relations with the world, with China, is something that brings fear. And I would say I don't think that many do know what exactly they would be doing. I think it would be a shock similar to that when President Trump was elected to lead the US.
Going back to Russia and Vladimir Putin, with the sanctions that they have kind of invented in recent months and weeks, do you think that Russia has been hurt enough to actually slow them down? Or do you think that's not enough and they still strong to go, and Putin is kind of, chances for Putin to create destruction more are there?
Well, I think that the destruction in Ukraine is ongoing. I think that the images and the news that we're receiving from Ukraine show that the Russian military is not stopping. If then it is adding a gear to what they are doing in Ukraine. I think in that sense, the sanctions so far and everything that the West has done have not produced a result in a sense that we would be able to say, look, this is we are seeing less deaths, we are seeing Russia less advancing, we are seeing some of the benefits. At the same time, I think one needs to be realistic about how long it takes for the sanctions to start hurting not just Russian economy, which is of course one of the goals, but also steering some kind of different opinions inside the political elite in Moscow. If we go back to our 1990s and the time when Belgrade and Serbia or then Yugoslavia were under the sanctions, it took quite some time for the elites, for the citizens to turn their back to Slobodan Milosevic and the people around him. So I think in that sense we need to be realistic on in particular if we know that the entire arsenal of potential sanctions has not been used. If we talk about energy embargo and many other sanctions which are still on the table. So I think the fact that we don't see result yet does not mean that we will not see some result, but at the same time, it is a call for more harsher and stronger sanctions against Russia, definitely.
How did this? We going. I mean, there is to talk about Russia and Vladimir Putin. I think we can talk for days about it. We already know that he have start committing crimes in civilians and so on. So, what are the chances for them to actually consider the use of nuclear weapons so far, and what kind of communication going with? Consider that we have Austriac, I think, Prime Minister, and also we have a few leaders went in Kiev to visit the Ukrainian President Zelensky. So this kind of involvements, how does that affect Russia or Vladimir Putin directly? And what are the risks of him going further than we think he should go?
Well, I'm not an expert for the issue of nuclear weapons, but I think what we have seen in December, January, and February ahead of the invasion, and U.S. government and its intelligence sharing information with the public, with the allies, and that all coming true, I think gives us back the trust in the U.S. intelligence system and to some extent into political class, that now when President Biden and everyone else says that the potential of use of nuclear weapons is not that big, is something I would be prone to trust. However, one point that I wanted to share from your question is the issue that we failed, or that the West has failed to acknowledge the tendencies that Russia had and not reacting earlier. You know, if we think about not just Chechnya or Georgia, but if we also think about political prisoners inside Russia and everything that has happened, for example, with how the history is being taught, how Stalin is being perceived by the Putin regime and by historians that he has basically employed to change the narrative. Those were all signs that unless West comes up with another kind of a strategy and reacts to it, that we would end up in situation that we are today. And I think that is a lesson for the West, not just when it comes to Russia, but also beyond Russia and in other places around Europe and in the world.
Going back to Balkans, where you and I are from, Kosovo, Bosnia, Serbia, Croatia, and the circumstances around, not to mention Montenegro and Macedonia, certainly Albania well involved. Russian influence has been slowed down during 1990s. Now the Russian influence came back through Serbia stronger than ever was before, until recent war. What is the situation now? And we know that in Bosnia, the Bosna Republika Srpska in Bosnia, they kind of try to match themselves with Kosovo. How is this going to end?
Well, I would go back to 25th of February, day after the invasion, when both the EU High Representative for Foreign and Security Policy, Josep Borrell, and NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg warned that that their expectation is that Russia would not stop in Ukraine, and that it would likely move to Moldova, Georgia, and the Western Balkans, in particular to Bosnia and Herzegovina. And as a naive observer, just looking at the map, one might ask, how is it possible that the Western Balkans or Bosnia and Herzegovina could be part where Russia could have influence? You know, there's Romania and Hungary, both NATO and EU member states, between Ukraine and Bosnia and Herzegovina, or the Western Balkans. If you look at the 6 countries, 3 are already members of the NATO, 2 have NATO troops on their ground, Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, and all 6 are potential members for the EU. So a naive observer might really ask, how come that Russia might have? But I think that the failure of the EU in the region has actually made the region very weak, and now with Russia's invasion on Ukraine, and the fact that where, you know, even Stoltenberg and Borrell have said, look, we have so many weaknesses there, we need to do more. And these weaknesses are very clear. We have 3 countries that are fully frustrated with the EU. North Macedonia and Albania are waiting to open accession talks for years. They can't get even that, not even to speak about full membership. Kosovo is waiting for a visa liberalization for years, despite implementing all the conditions that were asked. And then we have, Montenegro and Serbia, which are negotiating with the EU about the membership for 10 and 8 years, and have no chance of becoming members anytime soon. And in Bosnia and Herzegovina, since July last year, we have, from the ruling coalition in entity of Republika Srpska, we have a full assault on the state institutions, on everything that has been achieved in the past 25 years of the peace process, and an attempt to dismantle the Dayton Peace Accords. So what I wanted to answer to your question is that I think that the EU politicians here in Berlin, but also in Brussels, and I think Westerns, President Biden has also spoke about the Western Balkans, that they see that the region is a weakness. They see that the EU has been unable to deliver on the EU perspective, and that something needs to be done. But what I'm missing is what concretely needs to be done. None of the EU politicians here in Berlin or in Brussels are actually offering something concrete to the region that can change the dynamic and strength and make these weaknesses disappear. in any time soon.
From your opinion, there was a visit from a head of the European Union to Ukraine, and they sent them, the president of Ukraine, Zelensky, received an envelope in it. Do you think that kind of envelope should be given immediately to the Balkans country individually to promise them that they're going to be, and kind of to convince them that Europe is the destination for them?
Well, let me start from the start. Yes, Ukraine, but also Moldova and Georgia have applied for EU membership, and the member states have individually expressed their opinions about these applications. And I have to say that there are two groups of countries. One group is the Central and Eastern European countries, from Estonia through Poland to Czech Republic and even Slovenia, who are very positive about the prospect of giving these three countries membership perspective and seeing them one day as full members. On the other hand, we have countries like Germany, where I'm sitting, but also Netherlands, Denmark, which are very skeptical towards any EU enlargement anytime soon, and who have been raising the issue of Western Balkans as an alibi not to do much with Ukraine and the two other countries. So the EU is obviously divided, despite handing over the questionnaire to Ukraine and to other countries. They are very much divided on where they actually want to see these three countries. When it comes to the Western Balkans, 5 of 6 have received these questionnaires and have answered to these questionnaires. Only Kosovo has not been able to do that because it has been constantly told by the EU and its member states that if it applies for EU membership due to the fact that there are non-recognizers, Kosovo's application would not be able to be forwarded. So with 5 out of 6, we already have this process that the Ukraine and the 2 others have already started. But the issue there is that this process takes very long, and there is no goal that is realistic, that is achievable in front of them. If you look at the Serbia and Montenegro, they've been negotiating since 2012 and 2014. But during that time, in fact, the level of democracy, the level of security, the level of how they relate to the neighbors, for example, in Serbia, have dramatically deteriorated. Rule of law has dramatically deteriorated. So there is obviously something wrong with this accession process. And in my opinion, what is wrong is the fact that neither the EU membership is at the table, nor something that is as an interim, that could serve as an interim step for Montenegro and Serbia. So in my opinion, giving a questionnaire to Ukraine and 2 other countries is borderline with hypocrisy, because if these 3 countries are being offered the same process that Serbia and Montenegro are well advanced on, that means that, in next 15-20 years, they'll be at a point where today Serbia and Montenegro are, and that is no perspective, no clarity on what's happening, and that is, I think, both misleading and dishonest from the EU side.
Does that mean that the European Union credibility, it is in question for quite a long time now, and they haven't done anything to actually kind of prove that what they say they do, or what they do, they kind of follow it up with plans? I think that the problem has been there since Croatia's entry into the EU in 2013, where many member states have been afraid to enlarge. But during that period, they were always saying, it's the problem of the Western Balkans. They are not reforming. Serbia and Montenegro were well advanced. In Montenegro, by that time, you didn't even have a single democratic transfer of government. You didn't have elections where the government has changed. In Serbia, had its own issues that most are well aware of. But when the North Macedonia came along, in 2017, when it managed to start to deconstruct the captured state from the previous
government, when it started to deal with the issues with Greece, with neighbors, when it improved the situation of Albanian speaking minority in North Macedonia, making Albanian an official, second official language in North Macedonia, offering a seat of Speaker of the Parliament to a member of Albanian community, and with EU not being able to respond to those kind of changes, it became very clear that it's not just about Western Balkans not being able to reform themselves, but also when some countries do reform themselves, like North Macedonia, which is an obvious case, but also to some extent Albania, which has done everything that it has been asked by the EU. It became clear that the problem is not just in the Western Balkans, but also in the EU. And in the EU, you have members states that think that, you know, first we need to reform the EU, we need to make it more simple, we need to make it more capable to react to global and internal challenges before there can be a new enlargement. And then there are a group of countries which do not want those kind of reforms, but at the same time want EU to enlarge. And that's, you know, now we are in a deadlock between those two groups, and that is damaging the EU credibility in the region, but it's also damaging the possibility for the EU to have impact in the region. If you look at what's happened in Serbia since 2015-16, we've seen border changes being again seen as, you know, along the ethnic lines, seen as a valid and legitimate policy. We have seen ministers talking about neighbors and minorities as enemies, talking about the war coming up anytime with Kosovo. We have seen war criminals that previously were handed over by previous Serbian governments being reintroduced in public life and giving honors and given funds to write their version of history. And I think that shows how little EU has impact in the region at the moment.
How is the Bosnia at the moment with the changes that are happening? We know that every single movement in Balkans, Bosnia is the one to pay the price, or Bosnians, Muslims, are to pay the price the biggest always. And do they fear that any movement that's going to happen in Balkans, that they're going to be targeted again?
Well, for Bosnia and Herzegovina, the most important thing is that the two neighbors, Croatia and Serbia, do not see interest in steering problems or having policies of border changes or anything that is similar. That is the top priority for the country. Sadly, in the past couple of years, we have seen, in particular coming from Serbia and some of the ministers, this entire story about Serbian world and the need to bring together all the Serbs in one community as being seen again as a legitimate. Also, we have seen from the Croatian side, due to the fact that they have become members of the EU, become members of the NATO, have seen an attempt to meddle into internal and domestic policies in Bosnia and Herzegovina, which at some points were borderline of something very wrong and inappropriate. But at the same time, also internally inside Bosnia and Herzegovina, regardless of what's happening outside, we have seen politicians championing the 1980s policies in a sense of, for example, Milorad Dodik and the leading ruling coalition in Republika Srpska have adopted in October a plan in which they said we want to dismantle the state-level institutions that have been created and that have been operating since late 1990s. And we are going to do, they said they're going to do it unilaterally. And if anyone tries to stop them in that, the plan said we would be ready to use the force. And then, of course, they also started to implement that plan, showing again how dangerous it is in the absence of any other vision and the agenda for the country, for the region, how dangerous the politics in Bosnia and Herzegovina and in the region can become. In that sense, EU policy for the region is of fundamental importance for Bosnia and Herzegovina, because at the time from 2006 to 2012, I would even say, when the EU had an agenda for the region, when it had a policy for the region, we have seen politicians in the country being engaged in a positive agenda, implementing reforms, and achieving things that the neighbors were achieving as well. So yes, I'm worried for Bosnia and Herzegovina. The narrative, the policies, the actions of politicians do resemble those from 1980s, and in the absence of EU policy towards the region, potential for EU and the West to have impact in the region is for that matter very narrowed, and can then provoke unintended consequences.
For Kosovo, you are quite well aware of changes in Kosovo that are happening. What do you think about new government of Kosovo, and did you ever have a chance to actually study of individuals that now we have in power, like Vjosa Osmani and Albin Kurti and Glauco Nusa, that they're covering? Actually, they are in joint venture around the country.
Well, I can compare it to what we have seen in North Macedonia recently, in a sense of you have a new government which is clearly making a break from the previous governments and previous segments of ruling, let's say, ruling elites, and is trying and is saying that it wants to work on fighting corruption, on implementing economic reforms, and trying to make everyday life of citizens improved. And we have seen that also in North Macedonia in 2017, 2018. But the fact is that both North Macedonia, Kosovo, or any other Western Balkan countries are very small, landlocked European countries, which are isolated from the most successful, most richest market in the world, and that is the one that belongs to the EU. And the level of support in the financial terms that any of the Western Balkan countries gets compared to let's say Bulgaria or Croatia, which are full members of the EU, is dramatically lower. So if we talk about any government that comes into power saying wants to have positive agenda, wants to have reforms, changes, and improvement of everyday lives, due to the fact that we are countries in Europe, surrounded by the EU, but isolated from the EU, the scope or the instruments that they have at their disposal is extremely narrowed. And on top of all that, Kosovo obviously is encountered with the fact that it is not recognized by some of the countries, that is not member of the Council of Europe, for example, that it doesn't have the instruments that even other 5 Western Balkan countries have. So what I want to say is that in the bottom line is that yes, it's good when we have new governments, it's good when they have positive agenda. They can do a lot of things when it comes to improving transparency, fighting corruption, when it comes to allowing small and medium-sized businesses to do what they are best of doing business, in fact. But that without these isolated, landlocked countries that are, encountering problems from, issues of people leaving the countries, because Germany is attracting quite a lot of labor force, to many other issues. Unless this is changed, and unless these countries are offered a realistic chance to become part of the EU single market and get the support, financial and every other support that the EU member states are getting, the prospects are very narrowed and are to that in that sense also not as realistic as much as maybe some politicians in the region might be claiming that they're willing to achieve. So I think that the focus also of the Kosovo government and any other Western Balkan government really needs to be also on finding a way how EU can offer something that is realistic and achievable to the countries in the region.
EU is always reacting on crisis. What kind of way that can be created crisis for the EU to have more attention in there? Should that be fake crisis or real crisis, or waiting to have a crisis, considering that Serbia is getting stronger, kind of they going more into the one-man system, I would say. Albania is pretty much the same. They have fantastic relations. They created quite lots of involvements in some kind of Balkania or mini Schengen. They're trying to work it around. How Kosovo can actually act and work within this kind of environment?
Well, I'm very skeptical, or I'm very against the idea that by creating some kind of a crisis, a conflict, or something similar to the war, will provoke EU to react and offer something substantial to the region. EU is surrounded by war-torn countries. It has been surrounded for over a decade. You know, if we go from Ukraine, in Ukraine we have a war since 2014, ongoing war. If we look at Georgia, if we look at Armenia, Azerbaijan, if we look at the south, everywhere we see crisis, we see war, we see death, and EU is not reacting. As we discussed a bit earlier, even for Ukraine now, which has a total focus of public in the EU, from France to Germany, everyone is focused on Ukraine. There is a sentiment of we need to support and we need to help Ukraine inside the EU, but the EU leaders were capable to offer Ukraine as much as the process that exists now for the region. So I would caution against creating a crisis. I don't think that's what's going to make EU offer Western Balkans something new to Kosovo as well. I think what would be good, and what also we at ESI have been trying to explain to policymakers inside the EU is that the failures from the Ukraine that are obvious now, in a sense of hoping that things will be good, is not a policy to have, and that in the Western Balkans, due to the fact of the situation in Serbia that you have also described, but also Bosnia-Herzegovina that we've discussed, the fact that Kosovo is today totally isolated in the sense of being able or being offered to integrate further inside the European or the global organizations, that the EU needs to be proactive, and that in the way it was proactive to Central and Eastern European countries in 1990s, when there was no war there, they were proactive because they understood the geopolitics, they understood the economic interests and the rationale behind it, and they offered the policy to Central and Eastern European countries, not because they were at war, because they were not. And I think that kind of an advocacy might lead to something. At the same time, I think we need to be realistic about what is possible at the moment. I think that the full membership in the EU in next 5 to 7 years is not possible for the Western Balkans, and the reason is internal disagreements inside the EU and the lack of prospects that the EU might reform itself anytime soon. So I think in a way that Austria, Sweden, but Norway as well, and Iceland were in 1990s offered a membership in the EU single market. I think that as an interim step, I think that would be an offer for the Western Balkans that would dramatically change the political relations, would change the possibility of EU to have influence in the region, and it would be extremely beneficial for the economic, political, and social development of the region. So membership in the single market means that the countries within 5 to 7 years, depending on how quickly they reform, would be able to enjoy four freedoms of freedom of movement of capital, people, goods, and services with the EU, which would make them attractive for companies, for example, in Germany, which are now thinking, after Russia is being closed, after the idea of needing to go away closer from China, would make these countries more attractive for the investments from the EU, and we would then have a realistic chance to include Western Balkans in the production chain of EU economies. I think that would, with that kind of proposals, with that kind of realistic possibilities, we could achieve something. Once these countries are members of the EU single market, once they show that they're capable to protect rule of law, defend rule of law, to align with EU values and other issues, and then become a bit solid and more economically prepared, I think that would make them more attractive for the EU membership. And in that sense, they could, as Sweden and Austria have in 1995, decide to go to the second step, which is then full EU membership and becoming part of the EU institutions.
What is your opinion about the Open Balkan that has been signed by Vučić, Rama, and Zaev?
I have to say that all the regional initiatives in itself, be it the common regional market or the Open Balkan, in the end do not solve the big issue of the Western Balkans. They're nice, you know, saying that the trucks will need less time to go across the borders is nice. Saying that a dentist who is working in Albania can one day decide to move to Belgrade or to North Macedonia and be able to work there more easily is nice. But that's not going to make Western Balkans ready for dramatic economic jumps that they need. Only by becoming parts of the EU single market, they will be able to do that. In mid-2000, 2005 to 2008, Western Balkans were encouraged to join CEFTA, Central European Free Trade Agreement. And the reason why countries were doing that, because they were, back then it was even more recent from the war times, was because they were offered a free trade agreement with the EU, the so-called SAA. And when we look today, which was more beneficial for economies in the region, we understand that 80% of benefits that have been seen since that time go to the SAA and the opportunity to have a free trade agreement with the EU. Only 20% of the benefits come from this regional free trade agreements. In that sense, I would say any regional initiative that is aimed to make things a bit easier for economies is nice. But at the same time, it's not sorting the big issue. I think that also the issue with the Open Balkans that has been raising a lot of fears around the region, and I would say even in some EU capitals, is the fact that it's not inclusive, that not all 6 are taking part, and that it's somehow a copy-paste of the common regional market, which was agreed within the Berlin process, where it was not just the issue about the common regional market, but you had inside the Berlin process also issues with missing people, with rule of law, with many other issues. So there is a sense of a feeling that, you know, we took out what was beneficial for us. We don't want to deal with missing people. We don't want to deal with the rule of law. We just want this economic aspect. And as I said, the issue with this initiative is the fact that the 3 countries are excluded. They are not part of it. And I would say, for me personally, the biggest problem is that the regional organizations that have been established with the view that they will help regional cooperation were fully excluded. You know, CEFTA, the Free Trade Agreement institution that takes care for it, has been excluded. Regional Cooperation Council has been excluded from the initiative. And I think to some extent that we have seen in the past year or so that has been changing slowly. Different institutions are being invited. Different other members of the Western Balkan Club are being invited, and there are attempts to do a bit more, but so far they have not achieved the level of inclusion that we have seen in the Berlin process and in the common regional market.
Albania and Macedonia are member of NATO, and Montenegro, obviously. Do you think there was a reason, if you're in shoes, or if you advise the Prime Minister of Albania, Montenegro, and Macedonia, do you think there was a time to actually team up with Serbia, that they haven't accepted quite loads of conditions that were set by international community to do with missing people in Kosovo, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, that they could provide information. They never did it. Being a bit more relaxed and recognizing being a bit easier with Kosovo on even it up the misunderstandings that they have. And we have, for example, 2 or 3 NATO members that actually, instead of setting us up kind of structure to force them into it, they kind of team up with them to create a bit stronger, I would say, created a stronger Serbia, which not normally was beneficial so far.
I think that the relations I think that Serbia has benefited a lot, in particular President Vučić has benefited a lot at the international stage due to the fact that he has engaged himself in more stronger cooperation with NATO members through different exercises, etc. And I think that the personal relations between Prime Minister Rama and President Vučić, again, have been beneficial for President Vučić. But at the same time, I think, at least if we look at the concrete actions, but also the narrative that has been deployed by President Vučić towards Kosovo, that has not transformed into any concrete improvement of relations with Kosovo. And if we go back to 2018 and the idea of border changes or land swaps as a way to deal with Kosovo-Serbia relations, you can see that there is something extremely wrong when it comes to relations to Western relations with Serbia vis-a-vis Kosovo. To me, it feels like as if suddenly the bilateral relations and cooperation between Belgrade and Western countries, organizations, be it NATO, US, have become the priority of all priorities, and relations with Kosovo have been deprioritized in that sense. And I think it has, for me, it has shown to be a wrong approach, merely because of the fact that the relations between Kosovo and Serbia have never been in such a bad state as they are now. I have to remind you, back in 2013, 2012, 2013, when Kosovo was the priority, relations with Kosovo were a priority, we have seen Serbia, even including President Vučić and the parties of the current government, have been willing to integrate Serb municipalities from Kosovo inside the judicial police system. They have introduced customs de facto customs between Kosovo and Serbia. Back then, of course, EU accession process was more credible, was seen as credible from Belgrade's side, so they were doing quite a lot. So I think that the West has to engage with Serbia, needs to engage with Serbia. I think also that the EU, with a concrete offer for Serbia, could help not just the West, not just citizens of Serbia, economy of Serbia, but also could help the region in that sense. But I must underline, there's very little what Albania and Kosovo, or Bosnia and Herzegovina for that matter, and Montenegro can offer to Serbia. You know, when the EU process was de facto dead in 2018, when EU had little or nothing to offer to Serbia, we have seen, you know, the ideas of let's have a part of Kosovo's territory, let's have part of the energy, water resources given to Serbia as, you know, becoming legitimate idea. But those are wrong ideas. Kosovo has nothing or very little to offer to Serbia. It is the EU that needs to offer something to Serbia in order to encourage, push for internal reforms in Serbia, but also to have Serbia normalize its relations, not just with Kosovo, but also with other neighbors as well.
Apart from the rewards that they should be offered to Serbia, what kind of consequences should Serbia kind of be shown that if in case they don't kind of bend down and actually recognize the reality or new reality in Balkans, that they kind of have some consequences, knowing that Serbia showed forever that when there is no consequences, they will never bend down and do actually what they're supposed to do.
Well, I would go back again to 2011, 2010, 2013, and argue that, in fact, carrots work better in the long term than, in the short term and in the long term, than any sticks ever could. I think that the best punishment for Serbia would have been if North Macedonia, with the change of the government and with the very good reforms that they were implementing, with a complete change of relationship with the neighbors and with the Albanian population inside North Macedonia, have progressed and have moved beyond where Serbia today is on their EU path. If you look at the level of alignment with the EU standards, North Macedonia is at the level and in some aspects better than Serbia. But when you look at the process, North Macedonia has not even opened the accession talks. So if EU would be able to say to, for example, Kosovo government, which now says wants to do reforms, wants to fight corruption, wants to do economic reforms. If it says to North Macedonia government, which also has already implemented a lot of these reforms, and it rewards them, I think that would be the biggest punishment to Serbia, because then citizens would be able to see that when the governments reform, when they improve relations with other ethnic groups, when they improve relations with neighbors and adopt and defend EU values and EU positions, countries do progress and get to enjoy benefits of being part of the EU. At the moment, it's very difficult for any pro-European forces in Serbia to argue that it's a must to work on issues relating to Kosovo. It's very difficult to fight this nationalistic sentiment that comes in Serbia. So in that sense, I think the biggest punishment for Serbia would be to have a process where all countries of Western Balkans could achieve a goal that is so beneficial, that is obvious, that if Serbia doesn't do reforms, if it doesn't change how it behaves towards its neighbors, towards the minorities inside Serbia, that the citizens and majorities and the elite would be suffering and left behind.
A final question, because we are towards the end of the program. Serbia have initiated 4 wars in Balkans. Do we have sufficient evidence still that Serbia can be taken to the court, international court, for the crimes against humanity, whether it's to do in Kosovo, Bosnia-Herzegovina, Croatia, or it was 3 technically?
I think that at the moment it is extremely important in a medium term to get Serbia to, of course, open its archives, to share its information about the missing people, and to change the public perception about what happened during the 1990s, to not have sentenced war criminals getting prime time to share a complete nonsense about 1990s, to have kids in schools learning a history that is different from that they are learning today, and for Serbian judicial institutions.
You're talking within Serbia itself? Within
the Serbia itself. And for the judicial institutions in Serbia to deal with the war crimes in serious way. I think that kind of a transformation of Serbian society is something that most of us would want to see before Serbia would become part of the EU. And I think to some extent that is possible. We have seen it in Croatia to some extent happening as part of the process of becoming members of the EU. And I think that is something that if EU would come with an offer to entire region, it's something that we would need to insist. When it comes to the potential lawsuits at the international court, I'm simply not an expert for that field, and I cannot explain to you in great detail if that is possible and what the path towards that would be.
Any message to the Albanian diaspora that they are our viewers?
I think that I'm saying that also to Bosnian diaspora, which I belong to.
Thank you for that.
I think we need to be aware that I think we need to fight for a dramatic economic, political changes in the region. And the only way to do that, because of the fact that we are part of Europe, because we are isolated or an island within the EU, is if we integrate Western Balkans inside the EU. So there are a lot of small fights that we can have. I mean, as a Bosnian Herzegovinian, we have a lot of small fights when we are in the EU at the global level. But the big question which we really need to come together and fight in next couple of months during this war with the Ukraine is the issue of, will EU offer deeper integration of the Western Balkans in the EU, be it full membership, which I think is not likely, or membership in the single market, and that is a fundamental, strategic, it's of existential importance, not just for Albania, but for the rest of the region. I think if we achieve that, if we come together, all of us, with our connections, networks, and links, if we manage that, then we can work on all the other issues that are close to our heart.
We're talking as a diaspora, isn't it?
Yes, as a diaspora.
Mr. Adnan Ćerimagić, thank you so much for sharing the time with us and information to the best that you did. And hopefully we will kind of meet up at some point soon to discuss successes rather than failures.
I hope as well. All the best to you.
Thank you again for your time. Teleshikues të Albuk TV, faleminderit që ishte me emisionin ton. Ishte zotri Adnan Ćerimagić, i cili na njoftoi pak a shumë me njohuritë e tina mbi gjendjen në Ballkan, gjendjen mes Rusisë, Ukrainës dhe sigurisht pozitën e Bashkisë Evropiane, që në një farë forme edhe shumë herët është pa që Bashkia Evropiane ka probleme në vetën e vetë, ka probleme në administratën e vetë, ka probleme me shtetet individualisht që e përbajnë Bashkinë Evropiane, cilat po që se nuk zgjohemi ne vetë, qoftë si kombet dvoglat mëdha apo bashkëpunojmë, nuk presim ndonjë mrekulli nga Bashkia Evropiane në një të ardhmet e afërm. Nga unë Sabri Agimi, natën e mirë u pafshëm në emisionet e ardhshme.